All right, so today we're really going deep, diving into Abraham Lincoln.
Beyond Honest Abe.
Exactly. This time we're going to see if there was more to him. A political mastermind.
Maybe even a master manipulator.
Ooh, spicy.
Right. It's wild how much of Lincoln's image was, well, made up.
You mean like Honest Abe wasn't like a real thing?
Well, not exactly. I mean, he did have that reputation for honesty, early on.
Sure, there's that story. Walking for miles to repay, what was it, a customer?
Yeah, he overcharged them. But his supporters really knew how to use that.
Turn it into like a political brand.
Exactly. Songs, speeches, even think about it, images, all playing up that Honest Abe angle.
It's funny though, right? Like, even now we still fall for that sort of thing.
Absolutely. Especially with figures like Lincoln. Back then, mass media was just getting started.
True. Think about that rail splitter image.
Oh, yeah. Well, he did, split rails when he was younger.
His campaign went all out with it.
Rails at the convention, come on. It was powerful, though. Connected him with the working man.
It's kind of like, I don't know, politicians today wearing hard hats.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Lincoln wasn't always comfortable with it.
Really?
He thought some of it was, undignified, even wrote about it to friends.
So he knew it worked, but, struggled with it ethically.
Yeah, adds another layer to him, doesn't it? Not just ambition, but, awareness.
So we're seeing this sharp political mind early on, but what about influencing people, personally?
Well, he was witty, a good storyteller, but it was more than that. He understood people.
Found their weaknesses.
I wouldn't say weaknesses, more like how to get through to them. There's this story about a wrestling match.
Oh, yeah, with the Clary's Grove boys, right. Those tough guys.
Yeah. And, well, Lincoln lost.
I was picturing him getting tossed around.
He did. But get this, he earned their respect just by, standing up to them.
They became his supporters? That's amazing.
Right. It shows you something about his charisma, this ability to connect.
Turning rivals into allies. That's a skill.
We see it throughout his life, building unlikely coalitions.
But that sharp wit you mentioned, didn't it get him in trouble sometimes?
Oh, yeah. He could be sarcastic.
Huh?
And there's this one time it led to a duel.
A duel?
Yeah.
Seriously? That doesn't sound very honest, Abe.
Right. But remember, he was strategic. Didn't want to fight, but couldn't look weak either.
So what did he do?
He manipulated the situation. Chose broadswords. He had a reach advantage, you see.
Oh, clever.
And then, get this, he demanded a board be placed between them.
So his opponent couldn't even get close.
Exactly. The duel was called off. Lincoln, unscathed.
Another example of him thinking ahead, turning a bad situation around.
But was it all just ambition? Or was there something deeper driving him?
And that's an interesting question.
And it leads us to something many people don't know about Lincoln. His struggles with depression.
Really? You don't hear about that much.
No, you don't. He suffered from it throughout his life.
What caused it, do we know?
Well, he had a lot of personal loss. Mother, brother, sister, even a woman he was close to. All before he was 30.
Wow, no wonder.
Yeah. He once said, if what I feel were equally distributed to the whole human family,
Go on.
there would not be one cheerful face on earth.
That's heavy. Makes you wonder if those struggles contributed to his empathy, right?
Maybe. And how he coped. He worked a lot. Law, then politics.
We kept him busy.
And he used humor, both to cope and to connect with people.
I've also heard he took these blue mass pills.
Oh, yeah, for his depression.
But those had mercury in them, right?
They did. Common back then, but we know now mercury is really bad for you.
So those pills might have made things worse.
Possibly. It
Yeah.
just adds another layer to this complicated guy.
Right. So despite all this, his ambition was still there. In 1858, he went for the Illinois Senate seat.
Challenging Stephen Douglas, a big name at the time.
This was the lead up to the Lincoln-Douglas debates, right?
Yes, and Lincoln knew he was the underdog, but he saw an opportunity.
To make a name for himself.
Exactly. Newspapers and the telegraph were becoming powerful tools.
So even though it was a state race, he was thinking nationally.
He understood media.
But those debates, weren't they long and detailed?
They were. But because of shorthand, reporters could transcribe them.
Word for word.
Yeah, and then they were sent all over the country through the telegraph and newspapers.
It's like he created a viral moment before viral was even a thing.
Exactly. And he didn't stop there. He published the transcripts in a book.
Smart move.
And even a campaign biography, carefully crafting his story.
Wow. Branding himself way before that was a thing. But didn't his first attempt at using photography backfire?
Ah, you're talking about the portrait at the 1860 Republican National Convention.
Yeah, I heard it wasn't well received. What happened?
Well, those early photos really showed his imperfections, the wrinkles,
Oh, I see.
and the delegates weren't impressed.
But he did figure out how to use photography to his advantage, right?
He did. He realized the right image could project power. So he started working with Matthew Brady.
The famous photographer.
That's the one. They created photos that showed Lincoln in a more dignified way.
Focusing on his stature, his gaze.
Exactly. And these photos were circulated widely, helping build his image as a leader.
So image mattered back then, too.
Huh.
But I'm curious about how all this played out once he got to Washington. That must have been a whole different game.
It was, and that's where we'll pick up next time.
Okay, so picture this. Lincoln wins the presidency.
Right.
He steps into this role. A nation divided. Skeptical politicians, and even his own party.
A lot of them saw him as an outsider.
I can only imagine the pressure.
Oh, tons of resentment. Those who'd won against him, they felt threatened.
Like he'd come out of nowhere and stolen their thunder.
Exactly.
So what'd he do? Try to calm him down? Push him aside?
Nope. He brought him into his cabinet.
Seriously. His rivals. That's bold.
It was brilliant, including all those different factions. It balanced the power. No one group could take over.
And he kind of forced them to work together.
Exactly. Kept his enemies close, as they say.
He's got a lot of confidence, too.
For sure. He wasn't afraid to be surrounded by these big names. People with more experience.
Who are we talking about here?
Salmon Chase, for one. He became Secretary of the Treasury. And William Seward, Secretary of State.
Those were heavy hitters back then.
Oh, yeah. And there's this story about Seward. When he found out about Chase being appointed,
Oh, this is going to be good.
he was furious. Hated Chase. Saw him as his biggest rival.
Couldn't stand the thought of working together.
You got it. Seward was so mad, he actually quit.
He resigned. Just like that.
Submitted his resignation.
Wow. How'd Lincoln handle that?
Calmly. He reminded Seward how talented he was, how important his role was.
It appealed to his ego a bit.
Exactly. Worked like a charm. Seward stayed.
And eventually, they became close, right?
One of Lincoln's most trusted advisors.
So he neutralized an enemy and gained an ally. All in one move. Okay, let's talk Civil War. How did Lincoln handle all of that?
Well, even before it started, he was already thinking ahead. He knew public opinion was key.
Had to make the North look like the good guys.
Right. Whoever shot first would be the aggressor.
And he wanted the South to take the blame.
It all came down to Fort Sumter. That Union fort in Charleston Harbor.
Where the war began.
Yep. Confederates wanted it surrendered. Lincoln had a choice. Abandon it and look weak.
Or defend it and risk making things worse.
Cabinet was divided on what to do.
So much pressure. What did he do?
He got creative. Sent supplies to the fort. No troops, no weapons, just supplies.
What was the point of that?
Think about it. It forced the Confederates' hand.
If they let the supplies through, they look weak.
And if they attacked, boom, they're the aggressors.
He played them, didn't he?
They attacked Fort Sumter, first shots of the war.
Giving Lincoln exactly what he needed. A reason to fight.
And a surge of patriotism in the North.
That's incredible. But leading during war is different than politics, right?
Right. And Lincoln had zero military experience.
So how'd he handle it? Just leave it all to the generals?
It couldn't. The stakes were too high. So he dove in head first. Learned about military strategy. Studied. Consulted experts.
He didn't. He didn't, actually.
He even commanded troops in the field sometimes.
Wow. I never knew that.
Yep. Recaptured the Norfolk Naval Yard.
Bold move.
But he did have his issues with some generals. McClellan, for example.
Oh, yeah, McClellan. Famous for being cautious, wasn't he?
Notorious for it. Drove Lincoln nuts.
I remember that telegram Lincoln sent him. Something about, what have your horses been doing lately?
That fatigues anything. Yeah. Basically telling him to get a move on.
So did he fire McClellan right then?
Eventually, yes. But very carefully. Remember, Lincoln always had the bigger picture in mind.
He couldn't risk making McClellan supporters mad.
Right. And this all leads us to a pivotal moment, the Emancipation Proclamation.
That changed everything, didn't it? The war became about ending slavery.
It did. But it was a tough decision for Lincoln.
I bet. So much pressure from the abolitionists.
But he also had to think about the consequences. Some generals, McClellan included, thought white soldiers wouldn't fight for that.
Morale would plummet.
Maybe even desertions. And then there were the border states.
Slave states that were still with the Union?
He had to be so careful.
So how'd he do it?
Timing. He waited for a big Union victory, and then he framed a proclamation in a specific way.
How do you mean?
He focused on the practical benefits.
Like what?
Freeing slaves would hurt the Confederate economy and give the Union new recruits.
Smart.
He made it a military decision, not just a moral one.
Appealing to everyone. That's impressive.
The Emancipation Proclamation was huge. It rallied support for the North, a calculated risk that paid off big time.
So we left off with the Emancipation Proclamation. Huge turning point. But the war. Far from over. I can't imagine those last years were easy for Lincoln.
No, not at all. By 1864, the nation was exhausted. War fatigue, you could call it.
All those lives lost. And no end in sight. You have to wonder what that does to a person.
Lincoln felt it deeply. There are stories of him pacing the White House at night, unable to sleep.
The weight of all those decisions. Sending those young men to fight.
He'd visit wounded soldiers, try to offer comfort. He wasn't detached from it all.
Right. It's one thing to play the political game, but to actually bear that burden.
And then on top of it all, he had to run for re-election.
Oh, right. 1864. Against, wait a minute.
George McClellan, the general he fired.
Wow. Talk about awkward.
Lincoln still won, though, even with the war dragging on and McClellan being popular with the troops.
People still trusted him? Even then. Why was that, do you think?
Well, things were starting to look up for the Union. Grant and Sherman were making progress.
The ones Lincoln had chosen to lead the army. After all that back and forth.
He knew how to pick the right people, even if they disagreed with him before.
Put the nation first, even above his own ego.
He saw the bigger picture, and people recognized that.
And let's be real, those carefully crafted images we talked about, those help too.
Father Abraham, the understanding leader, it resonated with people.
But I think it was more than just an image. It was genuine. People felt that.
Right. So he wins the election, war's ending. What does he do?
Focuses on making sure slavery is abolished for good. The 13th Amendment.
His life's work. A new nation.
But he didn't live to see it fully realized, did he?
That's the tragedy. Assassinated, just days after the war ended.
A reminder that even in victory, darkness can still strike.
A heartbreaking ending to an incredible life. But his legacy as a leader, a strategist, a manipulator even, it all grew stronger.
So looking back at Lincoln, what do we learn?
Leadership is complicated. It's more than just charisma or power.
He understood people, knew how to connect with them, motivate them.
He wasn't afraid to challenge the norm, to take risks, to adapt. He was constantly learning.
And he was a master communicator,
Yeah.
crafting stories that resonated with everyone.
But through it all, he held on to his values: honesty, integrity, a belief in democracy.
We asked if Honest Abe was real or just a persona. It's more complex than that, isn't it?
He was both honest and ambitious, principled, but also pragmatic.
And that's the lesson, maybe. Leadership is rarely black and white.
It's about navigating the gray areas, making tough calls, sometimes bending the rules for the greater good.
Lincoln reminds us that even the greatest figures were human, with flaws and contradictions.
And in those imperfections, we often find the most fascinating parts of their stories.
He wasn't perfect, but he led the nation through its darkest time.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, think about this. Knowing what we now know about Lincoln, do you admire him more or less? Was he a master manipulator or just a leader doing what had to be done? Something to think about.